January 10, 1475. Eastern Europe was locked in iron winter. The rivers of Moldavia lay sealed beneath thick ice. Forests were drowned in fog, and the land itself seemed lifeless. On this frozen morning, near the small town of Vaslui, one of the most lopsided confrontations in medieval military history was about to unfold. Fewer than 20,000 Moldovan defenders stood against an Ottoman force 4 times their size, an army so large that contemporary chroniclers described it as stretching across valleys and hills like a moving city of steel. The Ottomans believed this campaign would be a formality. By nightfall, Moldavia was supposed to be broken, its ruler crushed, and its lands folded permanently into the expanding empire of the Sultan. What happened instead shocked Europe and echoed through history as a lesson in terrain, discipline, and leadership. The ruler of Moldavia at the center of this storm was Stephen the Great, a man already hardened by decades of war. Stephen had spent most of his reign fighting for survival. Moldavia was a small principality trapped between giants. To the south stood the Ottoman Empire, fresh from the conquest of Constantinople and rapidly swallowing the Balkans. To the west lay Hungary, powerful but politically unstable. To the north and east, Poland, Lithuania exerted its own pressure. Moldavia was not meant to survive in such a neighborhood, yet Stephen had kept it alive through relentless campaigning, careful diplomacy, and a deep understanding of his homeland's terrain. The Ottomans did not invade Moldavia blindly. For years, Stephen had resisted Ottoman demands for tribute, interfered with Ottoman vassals in Wallachia, and launched raids across the Danube that humiliated imperial commanders. These actions could not go unanswered. Sultan Mehmed Roman II, conqueror of Constantinople, authorized a massive punitive expedition. Command of the army was given to Hadim Suleiman Pasha, an experienced general leading a coalition force that included Ottoman regulars, Balkan auxiliaries, and cavalry from vassal states. The army's numbers are debated by historians, but even conservative estimates place it far above anything Moldavia could field directly. From the Ottoman perspective, the strategy seemed sound. March in winter when enemy agriculture could not support resistance, overwhelm Moldavia with sheer numbers, crush Stephen in a decisive battle, and install a compliant ruler. The Ottomans had done this many times before. What they underestimated was that Stephen had been preparing for this exact scenario for years. Stephen knew he could not meet the Ottomans in open battle on dry ground. Ottoman armies excelled in conventional engagements. Their cavalry could envelop flanks, their infantry advanced steadily behind disciplined formations, and their command structure allowed flexibility on the battlefield. Instead, Stephen chose to fight Moldavia itself as a weapon. He ordered villages evacuated, crops destroyed, and wells poisoned along the Ottoman advance routes. Livestock was driven into forests or slaughtered. What the Ottomans found as they advanced was not a land ready to be conquered, but a frozen wasteland that offered no shelter, no food, and no clear enemy. Winter warfare in the medieval world was brutal even for disciplined armies. Roads vanished beneath snow and mud. Horses weakened quickly without fodder. Armor became heavier and more dangerous as moisture froze against metal. Fog reduced visibility to mere meters. Stephen understood this intimately. Moldavian soldiers were drawn from the land itself. They knew the marshes, forests, and narrow valleys by heart. Ottoman troops, many recruited from warmer regions, did not. The battlefield Stephen selected near Vaslui was not accidental. It lay in a low valley surrounded by wooded hills and marshland. In summer, this terrain was difficult. In winter, it became deadly. Frozen marshes could support weight until they suddenly could not. Fog pooled thickly in the valley, muffling sound and disorienting movement. Stephen prepared the ground weeks in advance, positioning obstacles, cutting hidden paths through forests, and placing signal horns throughout the hills to amplify confusion during the battle. Stephen's army itself was a carefully assembled force. It included Moldavian peasants trained as infantry, boyars and retainers fighting as heavy cavalry, and mercenaries from neighboring regions. Crucially, Stephen did not rely on numbers. He relied on timing and coordination. His troops were positioned in layers, not lines. Forward elements were meant to provoke and retreat. Hidden flanks waited in silence. Reserves remained unseen, preserving the illusion that the Moldavian army was much larger than it truly was. As the Ottoman army approached Vaslui, confidence was high. Scouts reported enemy resistance, but failed to detect the full Moldavian deployment. The fog worked in Stephen's favor even before the first blow was struck. Ottoman commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as units lost visual contact with each other. Orders became delayed. Signals were misinterpreted. In a medieval army, confusion was often more deadly than enemy weapons. On the morning of January 10, Ottoman forces advanced into the valley. What they believed to be the Moldavian main force appeared ahead, small and vulnerable. The Ottomans pressed forward aggressively, eager to crush resistance quickly. Drums beat, standards advanced into the fog, then the horns sounded. From every direction, echoing across the frozen valley, Moldavian horns blasted in unison. The sound bounced off hills and forests, making it impossible to determine the enemy's true position or strength. Ottoman units hesitated, some advanced, others slowed. Cavalry formations lost alignment. In the fog, Moldavian skirmishers struck and vanished, cutting down isolated soldiers and drawing Ottoman troops deeper into the trap. The ground itself turned traitor, horses slipped on ice, wagons bogged down in frozen marshes that cracked under weight. Ottoman formations compressed as they attempted to maintain control, making them vulnerable to missile fire from unseen slopes. Moldavian archers and crossbowmen fired from cover, targeting officers and standard bearers, further eroding command cohesion. Stephen remained out of sight, directing the battle through messengers and prearranged signals. His objective was not immediate annihilation, but exhaustion and panic. The longer the Ottomans remained trapped in the valley, the worse their situation became. Cold stiffened limbs, fog thickened, units lost their bearings. Friendly troops clashed with each other in confusion. By midday, the Ottomans realized they were not facing a retreating enemy, but a deliberate encirclement. Attempts to regroup were met with sudden Moldavian attacks from forests and hills. What had begun as an advance turned into a struggle to survive. Panic spread rapidly in an army unprepared for such conditions. When Ottoman lines finally broke, the retreat became catastrophic. This was only the beginning of the disaster. By the time the sun reached its highest point over the frozen valley of Vaslui, the Ottoman army was no longer advancing. It was unraveling. What had begun as a confident imperial march had collapsed into a series of isolated struggles, each unit fighting its own invisible war inside the fog. Orders issued by Ottoman commanders could no longer be executed with precision. Messengers failed to find their targets. Flags vanished into the mist. The battlefield had ceased to exist as a single space and had become a maze of fear, noise, and ice. At the center of the Ottoman command stood Hadim Suleiman Pasha **, a veteran leader who understood warfare but had never faced an enemy like Stephen of Moldavia on terrain like this. Suleiman Pasha attempted to reassert control, ordering the Janissaries forward to stabilize the line. Under normal circumstances, these elite troops could be relied upon to restore order. At Vaslui, even they were reduced to confusion. The fog prevented coordinated movement. Ice robbed them of speed and balance. Moldavian arrows and crossbow bolts struck from directions that could not be identified. Stephen's plan was now unfolding exactly as intended. The initial Moldavian units that had appeared to retreat were not fleeing at all. They were drawing the Ottomans deeper into the valley, where maneuver was impossible and numbers became a liability. As Ottoman formations pressed forward, Their own rear lines became clogged with supply wagons, cavalry, and auxiliary troops. The larger the army, the harder it became to turn or withdraw. At a prearranged signal, Moldavian forces hidden along the wooded slopes began a coordinated assault. Infantry surged from the trees, striking Ottoman flanks with spears, axes, and swords. Cavalry emerged from concealed paths, charging downhill into disorganized enemy units. The attacks were sudden and overwhelming, but they were not reckless. Moldavian commanders avoided prolonged engagements. They struck hard, shattered cohesion, and withdrew before Ottoman units could respond effectively. The horns sounded again, louder than before. To the Ottomans, it seemed as if an enormous army surrounded them. Chroniclers later wrote that soldiers believed they were fighting ghosts, an enemy that appeared and vanished without warning. Panic spread faster than any command. Once fear took hold, discipline collapsed. Soldiers abandoned formation to seek escape routes that did not exist. The frozen marshes became death traps. Ottoman cavalry attempting to flee broke through ice that could not support the weight of armored men and horses. Wagons overturned. Artillery pieces were abandoned. The cold water beneath the ice killed quickly. Survivors dragged themselves out only to be cut down by Moldavian infantry waiting along the edges. Stephen now committed his reserves. These fresh troops, unseen until this moment, crashed into the exhausted Ottoman center. What little cohesion remained disintegrated. Ottoman attempts to counterattack failed as units collided with each other in the fog. Some soldiers fled toward the rear, only to find their path blocked by their own baggage trains and retreating allies. Others pushed forward blindly, running straight into Moldavian kill zones. The psychological impact was devastating. Ottoman soldiers had faced fierce enemies before, but rarely had they faced a battlefield that seemed actively hostile. The cold numbed hands and slowed reactions. Weapons slipped from frozen fingers. Armor became a burden rather than protection. Every breath burned. Stephen had turned winter itself into an ally, one that fought relentlessly and without mercy. As afternoon approached, the Ottoman army ceased to function as an army at all. It became a mass of individuals struggling to survive. Suleiman Pasha reportedly attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal, but the fog and chaos made centralized command impossible. Moldavian forces pursued relentlessly, cutting down retreating units and preventing regrouping. The retreat quickly turned into a rout. Ottoman troops fled southward toward the Prut River, abandoning equipment, banners, and wounded comrades. Stephen had anticipated this as well. Bridges had been destroyed. Narrow crossings were guarded. The riverbanks became scenes of slaughter as Moldavian troops intercepted fleeing soldiers. Many Ottomans drowned attempting to cross icy waters under pursuit. By nightfall, the battlefield was silent except for the groans of the wounded and the crack of ice shifting beneath frozen corpses. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers were dead, captured, or scattered beyond recovery. Moldavian losses were comparatively light, a staggering imbalance that stunned contemporaries across Europe. What had been intended as a decisive imperial punishment had instead become one of the worst Ottoman defeats of the 15th century. Stephen did not allow victory to breed complacency. He ordered pursuit to continue for days, harassing surviving Ottoman units as they withdrew from Moldavia. Captured enemy banners were sent to Christian courts across Europe as proof of victory. Stephen understood that this battle was not just a military triumph, but a political message. Moldavia was not an easy conquest. It was a fortress shaped by land, climate, and will. News of the disaster spread rapidly. Chroniclers in Hungary, Poland, and Italy recorded the battle with astonishment. Pope Sixtus Roman IV would later praise Stephen as an athlete of Christendom, recognizing that this victory had halted Ottoman expansion in the region, at least temporarily. For the Ottomans, the defeat forced a reassessment of strategy. Never again would Moldavia be underestimated so casually. The Battle of Vaslui was not won by chance, nor by miracle alone. It was the result of preparation measured in years, a deep understanding of terrain, and a willingness to fight an enemy on terms they could not control. Stephen had demonstrated that numbers did not guarantee victory. Intelligence, patience, and environment could destroy even the most powerful army in Europe. Yet the consequences of this victory would extend far beyond the frozen valley where it was fought. The shockwaves from the frozen valley of Vaslui did not stop at Moldavia's borders. Within weeks, news of the catastrophe reached every major court in Eastern and Central Europe. Messengers carried accounts of an Ottoman army shattered by cold, fog, and a ruler who had turned geography into a weapon. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had advanced almost uninterrupted, absorbing kingdoms, crushing crusades, and humbling Christian powers that believed faith alone could stop imperial steel. Vaslui broke that psychological spell. For the first time in a generation, a small frontier state had not merely resisted the Ottomans, but annihilated a massive expeditionary force in open war. In Hungary and Poland, the reaction was immediate and intense. Chroniclers described the victory in almost mythic terms, portraying Moldavia as a bulwark that had absorbed a blow meant for the rest of Christendom. Hungarian nobles who had previously doubted Stephen's defiance now recognized its value. Polish leaders, long concerned about Ottoman influence creeping northward, saw in Stephen an ally who had proven that resistance was possible. Diplomatic envoys arrived in Suceava, Moldavia's capital, bringing praise, promises, and cautious proposals for cooperation. The Vatican responded with particular enthusiasm. Pope Sixtus Roman IV, informed by reports from multiple sources, publicly praised Stephen's victory as a divine intervention achieved through discipline and resolve. While papal rhetoric often exaggerated military events, this time the facts required little embellishment. A numerically inferior Christian army had destroyed a much larger Ottoman force at the height of imperial power. Stephen was celebrated as a defender of the faith, not merely because he had won a battle, but because he had disrupted the Ottoman narrative of inevitability. Yet Stephen himself did not indulge in triumphal illusions. He understood the deeper truth behind Vaslui. The Ottomans were wounded, not broken. The empire that had recovered from defeats before would recover again. The victory bought time, prestige, and leverage, but it did not guarantee survival. Stephen used the aftermath wisely. He sent captured Ottoman banners and weapons to European courts as physical proof of the defeat, reinforcing the credibility of his appeals for alliances and material support. At the same time, Stephen strengthened Moldavia's defenses. Fortresses were repaired and expanded. Garrisons were reinforced. Supply routes were secured for future campaigns. The winter victory had proven what Moldavian forces could achieve under ideal conditions. Stephen knew that future battles might not offer fog, ice, and terrain so perfectly aligned with his strategy. He prepared accordingly. Across the Danube, the reaction was very different. In the Ottoman court, the defeat at Vaslui was received with disbelief and anger. Sultan Mehmed Roman II, conqueror of Constantinople, had built his reputation on relentless success. Reports of mass casualties, lost banners, and commanders barely escaping alive were humiliating. Ottoman chroniclers attempted to soften the blow by emphasizing the harsh weather and treacherous terrain, but these explanations only reinforced the reality that imperial planning had failed. The defeat forced a strategic reassessment. Moldavia could no longer be treated as a minor rebellious state. It had demonstrated the ability to coordinate complex operations, mobilize its population, and exploit imperial weaknesses. Mehmed Roman II began preparations for retaliation almost immediately. Plans were drawn up for a much larger campaign, one that would leave nothing to chance and would be conducted under conditions less favorable to Moldavian tactics. Stephen anticipated this response. Rather than waiting passively, he intensified diplomatic outreach. He reminded neighboring powers that Moldavia's fall would expose them directly to Ottoman pressure. He emphasized that Vaslui was not merely a Moldavian victory, but a European one. While some rulers offered genuine support, others hesitated, constrained by internal politics or skeptical that such a victory could be repeated. Despite the praise, Stephen faced a familiar problem. Europe admired resistance to the Ottomans, but it was far less eager to commit troops and resources. Crusading enthusiasm had waned after repeated failures. Kings and princes calculated risks carefully, often preferring symbolic support to real military aid. Stephen understood this pattern well. He had never relied fully on external help and did not intend to start now. Internally, the victory transformed Moldavian society. Morale soared. The peasantry, which had borne the brunt of scorched-earth tactics and winter mobilization, now saw tangible proof that sacrifice could bring survival. The boyars, some of whom had previously questioned Stephen's relentless warfare, found their doubts silenced. Authority consolidated around a ruler who had delivered one of the greatest victories in the region's history. Military lessons from Vaslui spread quickly. Commanders across Eastern Europe studied the battle, focusing on Stephen's use of terrain, deception, and layered defense. The idea that a smaller force could defeat a vastly larger one by controlling space, rather than seeking decisive clashes, gained new credibility. Vaslui became a reference point, cited whenever discussions turned to asymmetric warfare in the medieval world. Yet the strategic balance remained fragile. Stephen knew that the Ottomans would return, and when they did, they would come better prepared. Vaslui had exposed vulnerabilities, and empires learn from humiliation. The next confrontation would not be fought under the same conditions. Stephen's challenge was to transform a single spectacular victory into a sustained strategy of survival. In the months that followed, Moldavia remained on constant alert. Scouts monitored Ottoman movements, fortresses stocked supplies, alliances were tested. Stephen continued to rule with the same iron discipline that had carried him through decades of war. Vaslui had elevated him to legendary status, but legends did not win future battles. Preparation did. The victory at Vaslui marked a turning point not because it ended Ottoman expansion, but because it delayed it at a critical moment. It bought time for Eastern Europe to breathe, reorganize, and reconsider assumptions about imperial invincibility. Whether that time would be used wisely by others was uncertain. Stephen could control only Moldavia's actions, not the resolve of distant courts. What followed would test whether Vaslui was an isolated miracle or the foundation of a broader resistance. The victory at Vaslui did not end the war between Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire. It merely escalated it. Stephen the Great understood this with brutal clarity. Empires did not forgive humiliation, and Sultan Maimed Roman, too, was not a ruler who accepted defeat quietly. Within months, the Ottoman court began preparing a response designed not just to punish Moldavia, but to erase the memory of Vaslui entirely. In the summer of 1476, the Ottomans returned with overwhelming force. This time, the campaign was personally overseen by **Maimed Roman, II**, whose reputation could not tolerate another failure. The new army dwarfed even the force destroyed at Vaslui. It was better supplied, more cautious, and determined to avoid the mistakes of winter warfare. The Ottomans advanced deliberately, fortifying camps, securing supply lines, and refusing to be drawn into terrain that could be turned against them so easily. Stephen faced the greatest test of his reign. He could not repeat Vaslui. The conditions that had made that victory possible were gone. Summer removed ice and fog as weapons. The scorched-earth tactics still hurt the Ottomans, but not enough to stop them outright. Stephen chose resistance over submission, fully aware of the cost. He met the Ottoman army at the Battle of Valia Alba, also known as the Battle of Razboini. This time, the outcome was very different. Stephen fought with the same discipline and courage, but numbers and conditions favored the Ottomans. Moldavian forces inflicted significant casualties, but they could not stop the imperial advance. Stephen was defeated on the battlefield and forced to withdraw into fortified positions. For a brief moment, it seemed that Vaslui would be remembered as a defiant but ultimately futile stand. Yet even in defeat, Stephen demonstrated why Vaslui had not been an accident. He refused to surrender. Instead, he retreated into Moldavia's fortresses and forests, continuing a war of attrition. Ottoman forces captured towns but struggled to secure lasting control. Disease spread in camps. Supply lines stretched thin. Local resistance remained fierce. Moldavia once again proved difficult to occupy, even after a battlefield victory. The campaign ended without the decisive conquest maimed Roman II had sought. The Ottomans withdrew, leaving Stephen still on the throne. Moldavia survived, not unscathed, not victorious in every engagement, but alive and independent. Vaslui had bought exactly what Stephen needed most: time and leverage. It had forced the Ottomans to invest enormous resources for limited gain, and had demonstrated that Moldavia would never be an easy prize. In the years that followed, Stephen continued his balancing act between resistance and diplomacy. He paid tribute when necessary, rebelled when opportunity allowed, and fought relentlessly to preserve autonomy. Over a reign of nearly half a century, he fought more than 40 battles and lost very few. Vaslui remained the defining moment, not because it ended the Ottoman threat, but because it proved that intelligent resistance could reshape the terms of survival. Stephen's legacy extended beyond military achievement. He became a symbol of leadership rooted in responsibility rather than conquest. He invested heavily in monasteries, churches, and fortifications, using faith and architecture to reinforce national identity. These structures still stand today, silent witnesses to an era when Moldavia stood at the edge of extinction and refused to disappear. From a broader historical perspective, the Battle of Vaslui holds enduring significance. It represents one of the clearest medieval examples of asymmetric warfare. A smaller force defeated a vastly larger one not through superior weapons or divine intervention alone, but through preparation, environmental mastery, and psychological warfare. Stephen did not seek a heroic last stand. He sought victory on his own terms, even if those terms meant letting the land do much of the fighting. European military thinkers later cited Vaslui when discussing the limits of numerical superiority. The battle demonstrated that logistics, morale, terrain, and timing could outweigh sheer manpower. It also exposed the vulnerabilities of large imperial armies operating far from secure bases, a lesson that would be relearned repeatedly throughout history. For the Ottoman Empire, Vaslui was a warning rather than a turning point. Expansion continued elsewhere, but Moldavia remained a stubborn frontier, never fully absorbed. The empire adapted, but it also remembered. Vaslui entered Ottoman chronicles as a rare disaster, a reminder that even the most powerful forces could be humbled by a determined opponent fighting on familiar ground. Stephen the Great died in 1504, having ruled Moldavia for 47 years. By then, he was already a legend. To his people, he was not merely a warrior king, but the embodiment of survival itself. Centuries later, he would be canonized by the Romanian Orthodox Church, recognized not just for victories, but for defending his land and faith against overwhelming odds. The frozen valley near Vaslui faded back into quiet farmland, but its lesson endured. Power does not always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belongs to those who understand their world deeply enough to turn it into a shield and a sword. On a winter morning in 1475, 20,000 Moldovans proved that history is not written only by empires, but by those who refuse to yield when survival itself is at stake.